Imagine spending hundreds of millions of dollars building a Formula One engine, following every rule, hitting every limit, passing every test, then lining up on the grid next to a car that did the same thing, and somehow has 0.3 seconds per lap more than you. Not because they cheated, not because they broke a single regulation, but because they read the rulebook more carefully than you did. That is not a scandal, that is 2026 Formula One, and it has not even started yet. When regulations change in Formula One, the competitive order resets completely. Nobody knows who is fast, nobody knows who found something. Engineers spend years reading the same rulebook, looking for the same gaps, arriving at very different conclusions. And in Bahrain's second preseason test, two teams arrived with conclusions that stopped the entire paddock cold. Mercedes had something inside their engine that nobody could see. Ferrari had something on their car that nobody could copy. And the FIA is now trying to figure out how to respond to both without fully understanding either. This is where the 2026 season truly begins. Under the 2026 regulations, the compression ratio of the internal combustion engine was reduced from 18:1 to 16:1. That is still dramatically higher than anything in a road car, but in Formula One terms, it is a significant drop. Rivals have already calculated that increasing that ratio above the 16:1 limit could be worth up to 0.3 seconds per lap. In a sport where thousandths of a second determine race results, 0.3 seconds is not a marginal gain, it is a chasm. So, how does the FIA police that limit? That is where everything unravels. Article C5. 4.3 of the technical regulations states that a static test at ambient temperature is the only method of measuring the compression ratio. A static test at cold, ambient temperature. The rule says the engine must measure 16:1 when the FIA checks it cold. It says nothing about what that ratio must be when the engine is running at race temperature. That gap between those two sentences is where Mercedes went to work. What Mercedes are believed to have engineered is an engine that measures a legal 16:1 when cold, and delivers a higher compression ratio when running hot at race conditions. The suspected mechanisms behind this have emerged through staff movements between teams and technical analysis within the paddock. Nobody at Mercedes has confirmed the specifics, and they never will. But the theories are detailed enough that rivals have taken them seriously. The first suspected method involves connecting rods manufactured from a metal alloy that expands more at higher temperatures than the surrounding cylinder components. The connecting rod links the piston to the crankshaft. The crankshaft is fixed, so when that alloy expands under race-level heat, the piston head is pushed further into the cylinder, increasing the compression ratio dynamically while the engine runs, without moving a single measurement at cold inspection. The second suspected method involves a tiny auxiliary pocket of approximately 1 to 2 cubic centimeters, connected to the combustion chamber through a very narrow channel positioned near the pre-chamber spark plug at the top of the cylinder. During a cold static test, that pocket fills as the piston rises, and the displacement reads legal. At operating temperature, that narrow channel closes, reducing the effective combustion chamber volume and producing the additional compression exactly when it matters most. Mercedes boss Toto Wolff addressed the situation directly in Bahrain, stating, "I think the way it's done now that you have to comply with the regulations, both when it's cold and when it's hot, doesn't give anyone any advantage because I think others have tried to measure it only when it's hot." That statement carries significant weight. Wolff is pointing out that rival teams were calibrating their engines to measure 16:1 at hot operating temperature, which meant those engines were running below the limit when cold, leaving performance unrealized. Mercedes calibrated to be exactly at the limit when cold, which meant they had room to go higher when hot. The other teams did not find this because they were not looking at the cold measurement as the variable to optimize against. There is one more detail that confirms this was no accident. In August of last year, the FIA formally confirmed in writing that compression ratio checks would be conducted at ambient temperature. That written confirmation came after Mercedes specifically requested it. The regulation already stated this. Mercedes asked for written confirmation anyway. That is the behavior of a team that had already identified the loophole and wanted documented legal clarity before committing to the design. Hal Thomas, the head of Mercedes powertrain division, invited an FIA technical delegate to conduct a hot verification of the unit. The engine was started, brought to approximately 115 degrees Celsius, and then tested as the temperature dropped to around 95 degrees Celsius. The engine measured within tolerance for 16:1 at that point. Rivals immediately noted that 95 degrees Celsius is nowhere near representative of actual race operating conditions, where F1 engines run internally at over 300 degrees Celsius. The pressure from rival manufacturers pushed the FIA toward a proposed rule change, an additional mandatory compression ratio test at 130 degrees Celsius, to be introduced from August 1, 2026. Covering the final races of the season. The vote on this proposal is expected to pass. But even that solution has a fundamental problem. If Mercedes' suspected thermal mechanisms only fully activate above 130 degrees Celsius and race engines run past 300 degrees, then the new test may not detect anything either. Mercedes may pass that test just as cleanly as they passed every previous one. Mercedes, McLaren, Williams, and Alpine will go to the Australian Grand Prix and through the first 13 races of the season, up to and including the Hungarian Grand Prix, with a power unit that fully complies with the written regulations. The other manufacturers are not pursuing a legal protest. As Red Bull's Laurent Mekies stated plainly in Bahrain, "We don't really mind if the regs go left or if the regs go right. What we absolutely want is clarity on what we can do and what we cannot do." They are focused on catching up, not fighting. And the ADO, the Additional Development Opportunity System, gives them a structured path to do that. If the FIA determines a manufacturer is running between 2 and 4% below the best performing engine, that manufacturer receives one additional in-season upgrade. If the gap exceeds 4%, they receive 2. Engines were homologated by March 1st, so no manufacturer can introduce changes voluntarily. Upgrades only unlock if the performance deficit is officially confirmed. While Mercedes were operating inside the engine regulations, Ferrari arrived at the Bahrain second test, having spent months stretching the aerodynamic geometry rules in ways that are locked into the physical structure of the car itself. The first device appeared on the first day of the second test, positioned behind the exhaust. Ferrari described it internally as a flow tuning device. The regulations permit an aerodynamic component in that region, but it cannot exceed 60 millimeters from the axle, a constraint that under normal packaging conditions prevents any device from extending meaningfully beyond the exhaust pipe exit. Ferrari's solution was not a clever part. It was a clever car. Their engineers moved the differential as far rearward as possible, exploiting available space beneath the deformable structure to legally create the room needed to position a small wing element with an aggressive angle directly behind the exhaust exit. The entire rear end of the SF26 was designed from the outset around the introduction of this feature. What the device does aerodynamically is direct exhaust gases toward the underside of the rear wing mainplane and energize the airflow exiting the central section of the diffuser. Faster airflow under the rear wing lowers the pressure on that surface. A larger pressure differential between the high-pressure top surface and the low-pressure underside means more downforce. Exhaust-blown aerodynamics featured on F1 cars in the early 2010s, before dimensional regulations effectively outlawed the practice. The 2026 dimensional rules reopened that possibility, and Ferrari built their car around it. On the second day of testing, with Lewis Hamilton driving, Ferrari introduced a second innovation, an active rear wing element, unlike anything else in the paddock. Rather than opening a flap in the manner of the old DRS system, Ferrari's design rotates the entire upper wing element 180 degrees. The rotation axis sits at the leading edge of the element, so when active aerodynamics are applied on a straight, the leading edge becomes the trailing edge, and the wing transitions from a downforce generating profile to one that minimizes drag and potentially generates lift.